So I said this message is going to be a little bit different style, and what I mean is I am going to ask some questions throughout this and kind of get us to interact, because we're going to look at covenant making and the covenant language of the Bible. And I've entitled my message today, Understanding Covenant Language, and why it's important to understand this. Now, my first question is, do you guys know what a covenant is? I asked Mark in Sunday school last week, and his answer was, it's like a promise. And a covenant is like a promise, but it's much more than just a simple promise. We're going to kind of discuss, I'm not going to necessarily give the definition right now, but we're going to kind of discuss it and learn what it is today. But I do have one question. Was a covenant something that was started by God, or was it something that was started by man? Does anybody have an answer for that? You can just shout it out.
I'd say God.
God started the covenant?
I think so.
Well, maybe in a sense. When we think of covenant, we normally think of the Bible, and to us, our only exposure to the covenant is in the Bible. But to the people back in Abraham's day, the covenant was something that was very, everyone knew what it was. And I'm going to read a little section here from James Garlow. He's a pastor out in San Diego. Actually, this book kind of got me started on studying the covenant, and the little background story behind it was I haven't really talked to my sister Kelly since maybe since 2 years after we moved up here, which would be about 8 years ago. But when I came back from college, I started talking to her on Facebook a little bit, and literally I've sent her the first message. I sent her an email saying hi and just, how have you been? Haven't talked to you in a while, to catch up. And even before I got her message, well, her first message was, by the way, I sent something in the mail for you. And then she went on to say hi and everything, and it was this book by her pastor that kind of describes it. But I'm going to read something that kind of explains the covenant and what the covenant was, and if it was God that created it or if it was man. The best way to find out why the covenant is so important is to take a look at what God had in mind from the start. The story of the covenant begins with God's heart being broken when he saw the destruction and destitution of humanity. He never designed his creation to be in such disarray and chaos. As he looked from heaven to earth, he observed that the ancient people, the people of Abraham's time, 2,000 years before Christ, participated in covenant-making ceremonies. They did this with full knowledge that once having committed themselves to each other, everything they had belonged to each other. They intentionally would release their individual identities in order to have a merged identity. Covenant making was something that was practiced by the people, the covenant ceremonies. And we're going to talk today, there's 8 steps to a covenant ceremony in the general. But it's something that God saw man was using, and he saw an opportunity. We know Jesus preached with a lot of parables. He used the stories of farmers and of fishing and different things, and shepherds, of things that the people knew of their day. God chose this covenant ceremony because it was something that they knew in their day. And so why is it important to understand this language of the covenant? Well, imagine we had Moses standing right here, and somehow he knows how to speak English. If we start talking to Moses and we use the word like wicked. Now today we can use the word wicked, and when we talk about wicked, especially if you're in Boston where we went to school, they'll use it all the time, meaning, oh, that was wicked good. And they mean good. Now if Moses over here knew English and he heard the word wicked, he'd think we're talking about something bad. Or how about the word sick? People will use the word sick to mean something good. He may think, okay, let's lay our hands on somebody, let's heal them. He may be thinking it's a sickness. Or if we said, to use one, let's say Mark. Mark, he's a square. Mark's a square. Moses may just be looking at me like I'm stupid or something because he doesn't look square at all. He's got a round face and not square. The importance of that is understanding our culture. We know what we mean when we say square or wicked or sick or cool because it's something that's a part of our culture. It's just ingrained. It comes natural. As was the covenant ceremonies. Everyone knew what the covenant ceremonies were, and so God chose to use them to explain the Bible. The word covenant appears 300 times in the Bible. It's something that God chooses to use to explain his plan for restoring mankind. Our very Bible is divided into two things: the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Our Bible is divided into two parts labeled with the words covenant. It's important for us to understand what the covenant was, to understand some of the language of the Bible. Now this one I want people to raise their hand. Raise your hand if you've ever had a point where you're reading the Bible or having it spoken to you and there's been something that you don't understand right away. I think the only hand I don't see is Abby, and that's because she doesn't understand what I'm saying. Although I think I saw it shoot up there. So there's times where you're reading the Bible and you don't understand something. A lot of the times it's because we don't understand the symbolism used, or it's something that's of the culture. So it's something that we need to understand. 300 times in the Bible the word covenant is used. And I couldn't even try. I tried to look up, I tried to find counting even just in one chapter or one book of the references to covenant symbolism and ceremonies. As we go through this, you're going to kind of see some of those things. I don't have anywhere near enough time to cover all the different times that God or Jesus or even one of the prophets refers to covenants in the Bible. It would take all day. And this is going to be a kind of a quick sermon to go through and just touch base on what a covenant is and what it means to us today. But it's essential to understanding God's plan for salvation and restoring man, to understanding the covenant, because it's the method that God chose. He saw that man knew this covenant, and he chose this. So covenant making has 8 steps. And first, we're going to just set aside the Bible for a moment. We're just going to talk about what the ancient covenant ceremony was. We're going to talk about these 8 steps and what it meant to men in that day, and then we're just going to apply it to the Abraham covenant, the covenant between God and Abraham. Then we're also just going to apply it to the covenant, the new covenant that Jesus brought. So here's your history lesson. The first of the 8 steps is the pre-ceremony actions. In other words, it's negotiations. It's where the lawyers got involved. In the ancient days, 2 people would get together and they would just negotiate the terms of a covenant. We talked a little bit about, and I don't know if you noticed it from my reading, but a covenant is where 2 people come together and they're joined at one. One example I will use throughout this is marriage. When a husband and a wife come together, they're joined as one. They become one identity. That's what this happened. So do you think a king and a peasant would come together and join in a covenant? Because everything the king had now became the peasant's, and everything the peasant had became the king's. This negotiation, and the part of the beginning of this negotiation was to negotiate terms that were equal for both sides. They wanted to see if this covenant was going to be good for you and good for both people. Talked to Mark last week. An example I used would be, say, a person who was a cow farmer. He had cows. He made cheese. And another person was a store owner. Well, they may come together and join a covenant because one's got a store and one's got the cow and the cheese, and they can sell the cheese in the store. It would kind of work out for both people. So it's the negotiations. Then once they agreed on terms, they choose the selection of the covenant representatives. Now, the families were very important that day. And there was households. You lived with your family and you worked with your family. The covenant representatives was usually the head of the household. The two leading men in the family would come together and be the representatives for the ceremony. But it wasn't just those two men entering into this covenant. It was their family, their descendants, entered into this binding covenant. And back to the marriage thing. When a man and a wife are married, is it just the man and the wife that enter the covenant? Well, it's theirs that enter the covenant, but the children become a part of that family too. And then their children's children. So it's not just the representatives that are a part of the covenant. And then the third is the exchange of robes, belts, and weapons. The two representatives would literally come together and they would exchange robes, they would exchange their belts and their weapons. And this was just a symbolic act. What it meant was the robes were the wealth, the possessions. What one man had became the other's. The wealth belonged to both people. The belts, they carried their possessions on their belts, even some of their weapons. But it just symbolized that all their possessions, and the weapons was their protection. They would protect each other. Their enemies, their allies, would become the same. They would become one. They would take on each other's weapons, allies, and enemies. It was kind of just the symbolic act of the two becoming one party. And the fourth, this one's kind of, in our day, we kind of look at that, and this is a little gruesome. But the walk unto death. What they would do is they'd make a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice. And they'd cut the animal in half. And they'd lay it on the ground with the blood spilled between the two. And the two men, the two representatives, would walk through that sacrifice. They'd walk through the blood. And the symbolic act would be meaning that anyone that broke this covenant, let their blood be spilled like this animal's. What this symbolizes was, what we need to take from this was, that the covenant was binding till death. This was not something that you could enter into and get out of. It was till death, in the wedding, till death do us part. Marriage is designed from the time that covenant, the time that marriage starts. It doesn't end until death. It's a binding contract until death. And that's what they were symbolizing. And literally, if you broke this covenant, your blood was spilled like these animals. This is how serious of a thing that they took this. And maybe it's starting to understand why maybe God chose this ceremony to help man understand how serious this relationship was. Number 5 is the pronouncement of blessings and curses. They would literally get together and they would have someone, after they walked through the aisle, we'll say, they would say the blessings that would come upon your house from entering into this covenant. We will have cheese to sell at our store. We will have a store to sell our cheese. Using that example. The blessings in a marriage. You will have a partner for eternity. You will have a spouse to lean on. It's the blessings, the good things that come from the covenant. It's the reason you're making the covenant. And the curses. The things that will fall onto your family and your household beyond the death of the representative, but the things that would happen if you broke this covenant. And the seal of the covenant mark. In the ancient days, the most common covenant mark would be that they would cut a little bit in their hand and they would shake hands so that their blood would kind of intermingle. I don't know if little kids in school always used to do it, and they used to get in trouble being blood brothers or blood sisters. They'd cut and they'd stick their hand together and let their blood mix. But the symbol of this was that first off, they would be marked, and second off, let your blood be my blood. It's another symbol of we're becoming one. We're one unity. And the exchange of names is the seventh one. They would take each other's names. Say, myself and John decided to make a covenant. I would become Dan John, and he would become John Dan. They would bear each other's names. And this was another symbolic act of the two becoming one. The unity of the thing. And then this is my favorite, and this probably will be yours too, but the eighth step, after all this gruesome and blood, this is the one you want. The covenant meal. They threw a feast to celebrate this. It's kind of like a gruesome thing, and we're thinking about the negative that comes with this covenant, but they enter into this covenant because it's a good thing. It's good for both sides. There's a meal, a celebration at the end of this covenant. And that's where they just celebrate this unity and they become one. Both sides come together. These are the steps of the ancient covenant making. God saw this in their society, and he thought, this is my chance to restore my people. I'm going to use this so that they understand what type of relationship I'm going to have with them. And so I told you, first, we're going to look at a covenant between Abraham and God. And we're going to run through these steps real quick. And maybe things are going to start to click. You're going to start to understand some of the things that you've heard and read in the Bible a little bit more. But we're going to run through these things and look at the covenant between Abraham and God. And before I start, I have one more reading here from Garlow's book that starts to show the pre-ceremony negotiations between Abraham and God. If we look at it, and if you want to look at your Bible or write it down, we find the pre-ceremony actions recorded in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. God knew that the covenant would be an efficient, effective way to reach humanity and to help them understand the identity of his love for them. By making a covenant with humanity, God would bind himself to them and ask them to bind themselves to him. Doing this would mean that everything he had would belong to them, and all the blessings of heaven would be theirs. So God searched for a person, just one person, who might be capable of hearing from God and obeying him, so that he could establish a covenant relationship with him. Before long, he discovered a young man named Abram, the son of an idol maker. At the first, the message seemed strange. Leave your home. Go to a new place. I'm going to give you some land. Abram must have been puzzled, but God didn't give up. I am going to enter into a relationship with you, God said. Abraham asked, what kind of relationship? The covenant? God said aggressively, assertively. The covenant, questioned Abraham. Yes, said God. And then this is Abraham's response. Obviously, paraphrased a little bit. You can almost imagine him saying, but God, when people enter into a covenant, it means that everything they have belongs to each other. Are you saying that you, Almighty God, would enter into a relationship with mere humans like me? God's like, you bet. That's what I designed you for. That is precisely God's intention. God wanted to enter into that relationship with man. He wanted to have everything that he had, he wanted to give to us. That's why he's love. He wanted to give us everything. So in this pre-ceremony actions, you can start to read through Genesis chapter 12 on your own. It talks about things like Abraham's role was to count the cost and respond in faith and obedience. He called Abraham to leave his homeland. He called him to step out in faith. That was Abraham's side of the negotiation, was simply to step out in faith. God laid down that the things of this covenant that will come to you will be your descendants, will be numerous. They will cover the earth, and they will be my people. Now the second is the selection of the covenant representatives. This one's kind of simple, between God and Abraham. Now, as we talked before, the selection of the representatives didn't mean that it was just these two entering the covenant. These were the representatives. It was Abraham's descendants that also entered into the covenant. They were the covenant people of God. It's referred to several times throughout the Old Testament. They were the covenant people of God. And his people were numerous. His descendants were numerous. The exchange of robes, belts, and weapons. Everything God had, he gave to Abram and his descendants.